Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Reimagined, a Hidden Compass series. I am Lauren Eckert, your always host, and I am thrilled today, back in the new year in 2022, to be starting again and to be joined by Daniella Zalcman. Daniella, did I get your last name correct?
It's Zaltzman, but it's counterintuitive because it's an L silent mistake. So.
Well, thank you so much for your gracious correction, and thanks for being here with us today. Daniella is a Vietnamese American documentary photographer based in New Orleans. She is a 2021 Catchlight Fellow, a multiple grantee of the National Geographic Society, through which we met and have been able to chat, and the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. She's a fellow with the International Women's Media Foundation and the founder of Women Photograph, a nonprofit working to elevate the voices of women and non-binary visual journalists. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us back in like the first week back to work for many of us. I greatly appreciate it. And it's been way too long since we've chatted. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to see you.
You too. I'm thrilled to have you. So before we started recording, I gave you a bit of a primer on the series, but for folks who may be tuning in, for the first time, in this series, Reimagined, we are interested in three overarching themes. So reconsidering commonly used words with heavy histories like exploration, imagining new worlds arising, the interface or interplay of others, and escaping our individual comfort zones towards better science, storytelling, and ways of being in a complicated world. Daniella, you fall well into all of these categories of conversation. So I had a hard time deciding on which direction to take questions. And so I've just kind of dabbled everywhere, which I tend to do. Anyone who's watched many episodes is like, yeah, that's the usual. I have decision-making challenges. So we'll do a bit of a mishmash of those question topics. The first I want to ask you about relates to conversations we've had in the past, at National Geographic Society as explorers, at explorer festivals, etc. So colonization and decolonization is a theme that plays into many of your photography series. I wonder if you could speak to your thoughts, your journey, your feelings about the word exploration, its histories, what we do with it modernly, and in other words similar to it, things like discovery, frontiers, etc. Take it away.
Oh, geez. So, I think there are so many words, phrases, parts of the language around photography and journalism that are pretty expired and maybe need to be retired and are just have been a part of the lexicon for so long that we just stopped to process. There's before I get into the entire conversation around exploration and discovery, just the sort of language of violence that has existed in photography for so long, of shooting, of taking a photograph. It both makes sense because there is something inherently violent and colonial about the ways in which photography evolved and first came into being. And then it stuck around for entirely too long. And so I think, we are very recently having conversations within our industry about what does it mean that this is how we have thought of our own role, of our own equipment, our machinery, our positionality to people we photograph, and what does it mean to actually think about intentionally changing that. And so those are surprisingly complicated conversations. You would think that people would be on board with maybe shooting is something we want to move away from, but it's language matters and words matter, and I think we imbue a lot of secondary value and meaning to the ways in which we treat conversations and interactions, even without meaning to. And yeah, I think photography and journalism at large have been hugely colonial up until the present day. It is very much still an industry where we believe that we are better equipped in the West to tell stories of communities, people in the global south, in non-Western countries, and they are themselves, which is categorically untrue. But we continue to use language that reinforces that, and so it's really something that I think we need to question. And that that goes hand in hand with using words like explorers and discoverers, where we still, I'm sure there are still American textbooks that call Christopher Columbus the person who discovered the United States, right?
Oh yeah, I had one in fourth grade. So
right.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
That was, not that we're that old, but that was a while ago. But I bet you in 2021, that is still the case. And it's just like, we should have understood by now. And we're having conversations about Indigenous Peoples Day. We're having conversations about toppling statues of Columbus. Great. But we haven't changed the language. And until we can collectively do that, and also collectively do it for children, because we are, you and I are able to have these conversations and stop and say, this has been ingrained, and we've been indoctrinated into this way of thinking and seeing, particularly the white Western male gaze. But then we feed those words and those ways of seeing to young kids, and it takes them a while to break out of seeing and understanding those things. So I think at the very least, in an educational context, we owe the next generation a more methodical, a more thoughtful way of framing these conversations.
Beautifully said, and comprehensively said as well. I so relate to that tension of, or maybe the stage of the conversation where you feel like many of these things should be easy because they are broadly being discussed, or at least in the circles we live in, they're being discussed. And yet the change itself, the transition to new language is slow, and is often met with quite a bit of resistance. But language is so important for framing thoughts, concepts. There's really, really cool linguistic research as to how language words can change our very neural connections, our synapses, and how we frame the world. So beautifully said. And I think the focus on education in particular is so important, because it's much harder to unlearn words, languages, frameworks, concepts, than it is to learn correctly, appropriately, thoroughly the first time. So I like that outlook. It's also one that tends towards hope. I see a lot of hope in the youth I get to work with. So well said. Can you tell me, sort of jumping gears a little bit, you have worked on many a project, Hyperlink a lot of your personal work, your personal websites and Women Photograph below for viewers. But I'd love to hear about one or several projects that have deeply impacted you on your journey as a storyteller and a photographer. And it doesn't have to be the most impactful. Superlatives make answering questions incredibly hard. But if you could highlight one project you worked on, whether ongoing or in the past, to give viewers a bit of insight into what you do.
I think I'll highlight two, and it is hard because every long-term project I've ever worked on is effectively still continuing and is a community, individual, family that I have intertwined my life with so deeply that I have been unable to extricate myself. But I think that's on the social documentary side of the spectrum. That's just what happens, and there's something amazing about that. The project that I've probably been working on longest, that maybe the context in which you first encountered my work, is a project called Signs of Your Identity, that looks at the legacy of the Indian boarding school system in primarily the US and Canada, but also elsewhere. When I first started the project in 2014, in Canada, it was not a system that I had ever heard of before. I had actually ended up in Australia at the International AIDS Conference presenting on some totally unrelated work I was doing in Uganda on the impact of colonization and the rise of homophobia. And I read a UN report that mentioned that one of the groups of people in the world with the fastest growing rate of HIV was First Nations people in Canada. And I thought, I am not a public health expert, but that sounds crazy. Canada has better healthcare than I do in the United States. And how could there be this group of people left behind? And so I spent a month, I wrote a grant application, and I spent a month traveling through British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And almost every single HIV positive Indigenous person I met and spoke to mentioned their time in something called residential school. And I had never heard of that before. And I think, at the same time, I was having conversations with, white Airbnb hosts and people I was encountering in Canada, and they had never heard of it either. And I thought, how is this thing that happened for over a century in Canada, in the United States as well, as I quickly discovered, how is this something that is not part of our education, of our consciousness of this country? And so, in short, for people who are watching who may not know what Indian boarding schools, Indian residential schools are, in the mid 19th century, both the US and Canadian governments created this network of boarding schools for Indigenous youth. And they were effectively kidnapped. They were taken by force from their communities, from their families, and sent very far away to these boarding schools where the explicit mission was to assimilate them into dominant Western culture. And that was often done through physical abuse. There was a ton of sexual abuse. There was medical testing done on young children. Young women were often sterilized. Horrible things happened to children in the name of severing their connection with their families, their language, their community, their culture. And the last school in Canada didn't close until 1996. And we tend to think about the way in which, again, returning everything back to education, because I think it's something that you and I are both deeply passionate about. We think about the way we talk about the oppression of Indigenous people in the Americas, and we talk about things that happened more than 100 years ago, right? We talk about smallpox blankets and the Indian Wars, and they're treated as events of the deep past, not things that happened within our lifetimes. So that was a very long way to say that, this project I've been working on now for 8 years has looked at that legacy. There are 80,000 people alive today in Canada who went through the school system. The United States is just now starting to go through the process of what it means to think about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so, I've worked both in the US and Canada in the past year, if anyone has seen this news, discovering unmarked graves for thousands and thousands of young children who were sent off to these boarding schools and never came home. So I'm deeply embedded in looking at the legacy of that history and how it continues to impact Indigenous communities. And then in a very different project, but one that is sort of equally consuming and equally important to me, I lived in Europe from 2012 to the start of this year in London and Paris. And I was there during the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. And, I started out as a hard news photographer, and I actually originally wanted to be a conflict photographer, and then very rapidly moved away from that and realized I was not good at it and didn't like it. And I no longer feel a need or a desire to work in reactive ways. I no longer want to sort of chase news events in the way that I did early in my career. But at the same time, I was living in Europe in the midst of this global crisis that was also being documented in what felt to me like very stigmatizing and very racist ways, in particularly the British press, but in a lot of European press at large. And I am a descendant of the two largest refugee waves to come to the United States. I am half Vietnamese and half the descendant of Eastern European Jews. This is a very important part of my identity, is the fact that asylum is a human right, and the ability to flee a war zone and seek safe haven elsewhere is a human right and a necessity. And it was really startling and unfortunate to me to see the language that was used in a lot of journalism. So I ended up going to Calais, which is this small, or actually not small, this fairly large refugee camp in a port city in France with people who are largely trying to get to the UK from Central Africa, East Africa, the Middle East. And I ended up meeting this man, at the time was 27, he's my age, named Hassam. He's Syrian. He was one of 6 adult siblings who had all ended up on the refugee trail and been scattered across the Eurasian continent. Each one had ended up in a different country. And so for the past, 6 years now, I've been documenting their family, what it means to have your incredibly close-knit family be torn apart by war. They were from Raqqa, which at the time was the capital of ISIS, and what it means, and also because I do think hope and looking to the future is a really important part of long-form journalism. Also, what it means to rebuild and what it means to bring up the new generation in a new place and figure out how to still feel connected to the place that still it feels like home to you in some way. So yeah, I usually am juggling about 4 long-term projects at once, but those are probably the 2 that are most meaningful to me right now.
Thank you for those answers, and the depth you covered in such a short amount of time is incredible. Really, you so eloquently described two really gutting, ongoing, social crises, really, and in different phases, but crises nonetheless. So many things come to mind. I think first we did first connect, and I was first exposed to your work based on the work you've done with residential school survivors. And as someone who grew up in America and then moved to Canada, I can, strongly second that experience of total lack of exposure to the truth, the sheer recentness of the horrific human wrongs perpetuated by violent colonizations in the US and Canada and elsewhere in the world, of course, and still elsewhere in the world, like ongoing wrongs. But it was such a period of humility and very quick learning when I moved to Canada, particularly because of the field of work I'm in and the Indigenous collaborators and those Indigenous nations that lead the work I've been a part of. To understand, that many survivors of residential schools who were torn from their families and abused at the hands of the federal government and religious institutions in Canada are they're still with us. They're my parents' age, many of them. This is not a deep past event. This is an ongoing violence perpetuated by the colonial nation state. And for viewers, I'll include 2 hyperlinks in this to learn more and regarding, or several hyperlinks now that I'm thinking of it, regarding what you can do to contribute to solutions and survivors. So one of our very first conversations was with a dear friend and an Indigenous language revitalizationist, Kirsten Doblers, and she really gets into this because at the time we were speaking was a period of time when the unmarked graves of children, residential school children, were featured heavily in the news. So more about that, I'll link that episode. And I will also link to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which is led by stories of survivors and the wrongs accrued through the residential school system, and then also action steps to what you can do as, a settler in North America, and whatever your positionality may be. And one of the things you can do is contribute to the Indian Residential School Survivors IRSS donation campaign in order to support survivors. We know that, that bridge you built to how you came to that story is fascinating because we know epigenetic changes occur when humans experience trauma. And so the ongoing burdens that residential school survivors and their children and, their family members bear are both mental and physical. The deviation there is categorically created by humans. So there's a lot of health impacts beyond just the profound trauma that they've faced. So lots more to discover there. And it's such an important topic that so many people are still largely unaware of because we have the privilege to be as settlers. And so highly recommend folks checking that out. And I would love after the recording to get links from you, Daniella, to learn more about the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe as well, because I'm less acquainted with that, but obviously aware of the tremendous importance of telling different stories, telling better stories, telling deeper stories than the ones reflected in often racist publications regarding those things, or fear-based publications. So thank you for sharing both of those, and what tremendous journeys you have been on through those with the people that are part of those stories too. I wonder, just as we reflect on those really important and intense storytelling endeavors, could you talk a little bit about how you're an individual who has different positionalities to the story you tell, but obviously deep compassion for the people you work with. How do you keep your own health, mental or otherwise, in balance as you form deep relationships with folks who have experienced a lot of trauma and are experiencing trauma?
It's funny. This is such a complicated question, and I'm really glad that we ask it, but I also have this visceral response to it of it's not about me. I'm
Totally.
And so but I also think that historically journalists have been so bad about being upfront with and being willing to address safely the fact that we are exposed to a lot of trauma.
Absolutely.
And many of us do have, complex PTSD from the work that we do. I think that, like I say, I very much want to underscore the fact that I have the privilege of being able to walk in and out of these situations. Yep. I can remove myself whenever I want to when things feel like they are too much and too heavy. And that is not the case for many of the people who are
totally
their time and their stories and their vulnerability. And I am just constantly grateful and amazed that people are willing to do that with a near complete stranger. Yep. But that being said, I think journalists are really bad at understanding how we have to take care of ourselves. And so there was a learning curve. There was definitely a learning curve for me of figuring out how to do that smartly. And the first trip that I took for Signs of Your Identity, I had actually sorry, I'm very rambly today, but the first trip that I took for Signs of Your Identity, when I believed that this was a public health story, I interviewed about 50 people who were dealing with HIV, and it was mostly communities in urban settings where this was tied up in the opioid crisis that we're still dealing with in North America. And so it was largely through injection drug use. And so I photographed that story and then got home and realized, this is bad journalism. And this is not actually this. I had only just started to hear these stories of residential school. And in the back of my head was thinking, that's actually the project. That's the story. That's the thing I need to focus on. The HIV is a part of this larger systemic issue. But I was an outsider and I was just starting to sort of unravel and understand all the nuances of this history and the way in which it was impacting Indigenous communities. And I was lucky to have people who were patient with me in explaining. I had never really worked in Indigenous communities before. And then so a year later, I went back and I focused. That's when I started working in, double exposure portraits. And I really decided that I needed to scrap the first body of work and never publish it and focus on survivors and their experiences. But I came away from that few weeks of work, I hadn't really understood what I was going to hear and the stories that I was going to uncover when I went on that trip. And it was a combination of it being at the very tail end of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So as a nation, First Nations people across Canada, Métis and Inuit people across Canada were for the first time in their lives digging up these memories, having these conversations. So it was the right moment. But I also had many people talk to me and share stories for the first time in their lives, stories they had never told their children or their grandchildren. And I still, it's hard to quantify just how terrifying these experiences were. And I talked to dozens of people who were sexually assaulted as little children, who experienced deep emotional and physical and sexual trauma. And so figuring out what, and then on top of that is the constant journalist crisis of, oh my God, how do I actually do justice to these stories? Because there's not I have this weird third party role of, I can take your stories and share that with a different audience, a wider audience, maybe, but I'm not materially doing anything. I don't have any power to change legislation I'm not a therapist. I'm maybe not even the right person for you to be telling these stories to. So, it's just, it turns into this massive existential crisis of, am I doing this responsibly? Should I be doing it at all? How do I make sure I'm doing this in the most careful and caring way? And so, a very long way to say that it's, there aren't always good answers for how you take care of yourself but for me, it's placing the health and the safety of the people who trust me first. And then figuring out my own coping mechanisms, which sometimes are just, taking time away and stepping back because, empathy fatigue is a very real thing. And the second I feel that, I know I have to stop. I have to figure out how to pivot for a little bit and then come back to it so that that is not a risk.
Yeah. I, again, am really grateful for that answer. It wasn't rambly at all. It was, again, beautiful. And you got into a lot of stuff that's as a social scientist and a settler, a white person, an outsider in these spaces, I also relate deeply to. I ask the question because I feel similarly. I have had to really work through a visceral rejection of myself as like a human who needs careful care and self-assessment in when working in spaces even tangentially related to this, because there is, of course, a scale of trauma. Like any exposure to people who have lived through so much and remain so strong and generous and kind and resilient, despite like horrific wrongs perpetuated against them, I think led me for a long time to feel really shameful for any challenges, mental health challenges I was having, because the scale of I had only heard about the horrible thing that had happened to them. And that was impacting me to such a great scale. And thus I couldn't imagine the suffering that they had gone through and survived and continued to work despite those challenges. So I deeply relate to the challenge of prioritizing mental health when you recognize the pain other people have and are going through. But of course, we are human beings and we can burn ourselves out. And to do the work, we have to like really carefully find this balance between self-protection and emotional vulnerability. And I think you covered, I won't add any more because I think you covered that really, really beautifully. And I think it is important, especially as storytellers, to decenter, but also to decenter in a way that we can still continue the work because we haven't burnt ourselves out or experienced empathy or compassion fatigue. So I think you covered that really, really, really beautifully. And I also love to hear how much, like, despite you speak to the fact that you're sort of this third party, but something I hope more journalists are doing that I'm so grateful you do as a storyteller is recognize your positionality to the story. I think a similarity between journalists and scientists in the past, in sort of a Western colonial framework, has been the tendency to see themselves, scientists and journalists, as outsiders entirely who aren't constrained by positionality or by being human. And of course, like, we all bring deep biases, language constraints, our life experiences, our racial, class, gender, positionalities, and many, many others to the table when we tell stories or have relationships or do science. And so I love the way you describe that. I will also say, regarding your comment about power, of course, there is power to immediately change situations and power to tell beautiful stories that help educate people, which I want to give you credit for engaging in, but I also recognize the feeling you're expressing, which is like, it is so important for researchers, scientists, journalists, storytellers, et cetera, to ask questions about how worth it their work is for communities, especially when it comes to these really challenging conversations. I think sometimes there's a belief that just storytelling exposure is enough trade-off for the emotional labor that may go into engagement in a story. And there's an increasing understanding, but not widespread, I think, enough, that is not the case, especially in Indigenous nations who are going to pour knowledges and, in some cases, like stories of trauma into working with storytellers. So yeah, I'm grateful for you bringing that up as well, but also want to recognize what you do bring to the table as someone who's willing to go deep and really carefully into this space in terms of contributing to a changing tide. So I wanted to say that, but hear where you're coming from as well. It's challenging to balance it all. We have covered a lot, and I want to be conscious of your time. I'm so grateful. We need to talk about like a bunch of other things off recording. This has been really, really good. I'd like to end, you mentioned obviously education is a passion and important to you. And I think we're on the same page with that. And also that while in the space of talking about these heavy and challenging things, I think it's important to also orient light towards hope for better futures. So I wonder if we could end with you telling us a little bit about what futures you dream of, like what changes you believe are possible or on their way in a better world.
I think we've had it's this funny constant balance that I think we're probably all feeling since George Floyd's murder of we are having many of the right conversations. We are having many of the right conversations deeply. Are we having them in ways that are sustainable and are going to stick around for good? Or are we having them to have them and get them out of the way and then go back to our point of view, status quo? And I think that is a very frustrating push and pull that a lot of us are dealing with. I would imagine, equally in science, journalism, and education. I spend a lot of my time teaching. I think a lot of journalists increasingly need to have like a secondary industry or space that they work in to feel like it's not just like I take your story, I put it in a magazine, and then hopefully that does something. So I think increasingly you see photographers like Stephanie Sinclair and Robin Hammond who are starting their own nonprofits. Or in my case, I love going into middle school and high school classrooms and riling up students about historic injustices that were maybe not part of their textbooks. But for me, being able to recontextualize and see outside of ourselves in a broader way, in terms of who we are and how power and colonial forces have shaped our social, political, economic systems. It's touched everything. It has impacted everything. And fish don't know that they're wet, right? Like it wasn't even I didn't even have the language to understand it in a Western context until I was in college. I had the concept of colonization hammered into my brain since infancy because my mother is Vietnamese and loves to talk about how Vietnam survived 1,000 years of Chinese rule and the French and the Americans, and we've still, fought everyone and kicked them all out. And so, at least I was exposed to the concept. Oh, we don't talk about it in America. We don't talk about it in Europe. And so, and how do we figure out how to build that context into acknowledging who we are and where we come from and how we relate to people around us? I think that, and that was an interesting sort of positionality privilege to have as an American living in Europe and thinking like you're not going to address that. You're not. Are you not aware of it, or you just don't want to say, or none of the above? Walking into the British Museum and thinking there's just put it back. Put it
oh my god! Oh my god!
The Kay Branley in Paris, where they'll have detailed descriptions of objects about how they were stolen from the museum, and it's just like, but where did they come from to start with? But how did they get from the Congo to Paris? No contact there. So
no, we're having those conversations, but it has not moved the needle, it seems, on the awareness from institutions like that yet.
Right. And it's happening at an individual level. It's happening in these these very particular spaces, but it's not happening at a governmental institutional level. And until we can do that, we are just pretending that almost every single country on the globe has somehow been impacted has had another country come in and say,
absolutely,
your resources and land and people are mine now. Until we can truly break that down and understand how that has impacted the formation of our modern societies, we're lying to ourselves, and we're disillusioned about so much of our own context. So I think that particularly I think for both of us, I love having those conversations with young people because they are so much more primed to understand than when I have those arguments with my parents or people even my age. So I think that's exciting for me. I love seeing that immediate receptiveness and that immediate connection to their own family history, to the things that they have seen but maybe not fully understood in the United States. And so that's where a lot of hope lies for me, is that the next generation will be more enlightened and more nuanced in their understanding of who they are than we were.
Yeah, I've almost certainly brought this up on Reimagined before, but I get to work with a fourth grade class, a teacher who teaches fourth grade, so several fourth grade classes over the years virtually, and I am blown away by what they already know and what they quickly absorb about the realities of the world, like not political discussions. I mean, everything's inherently political, but fundamental truths about the world. And I often get this like really emotional feeling about they're 20 years ahead of me in the unlearning process. There are some things they won't ever have to unlearn. And, you know, when you talk about the frameworks we were raised in of colonial brain, I am certainly still on a journey to root out, and may never completely root out, a lot of deep biases about colonization and societies and race. Like, it is a lifelong process if that was your framework for 18 years of your life. And I am so stoked for kids that are alive now, who are 12, 15, 18, who are ahead of me. It's awesome. It's so awesome. And I'm so glad for the work they won't have to do. They'll have a lot of work to do, but they'll have less internal work to do, which doesn't, yeah.
You know, it's access to stories, right?
Yeah.
Like, we think about who the names on our history textbooks were when we were in elementary school, high school, college. It was largely white men.
Oh, yeah.
And it still is largely white men, but it is changing. But there is process, and there is emphasis, and there are more non-white. I mean, still, I don't even know what the numbers are in academia, and I'm sure it is still crushingly terrible.
Yeah.
But we are starting to see change, and we are starting to see why there is a need for change. So,
and we got to be grateful for the incremental, or else we'll lose our minds. So
exactly. It's that constant balance of like, do we work with the broken system we have, or do we burn it down and start over? And I love to burn things down and start over, but we can't always.
No. And often more people, the people who need, it's appropriate to let the people who need change most make the decisions about which way to go. So I'm still trying to learn to follow. We are, as a white woman, like, you so receive the message that it's appropriate to lead because you're white, and these conversations are not for me to lead. They're for me to reflect deeply on and like lead in the context of settler scholars or approaching white fragility. But a lot of it is my job to get out of the way and follow and support. So still learning much to learn. I'm so grateful for you in this conversation, though. Man, we have to have maybe like rage fest or long conversations more often about navigating these things, because while we're on sort of in different institutions, they share a lot of the same problems, challenges, opportunities. Thank you. Anything else you want to share with folks? Any resources? You can of course send me them, and I can put them in the hyperlink of the video, but anything else, I'm happy to hear now.
I will definitely send you resources. No, I think, just to reiterate, I think for me, it really is about who is telling our collective story. And that's the thing, that whether it's in the context of, the nonprofit that I started, Women Photograph, or the way that I work on my own projects. And I think the pandemic has both been like the worst thing imaginable for a freelance photographer, but also has been great because it has given me time to think about how these projects can be more collaborative, how they can incorporate the voices and the storytelling of people who I have been documenting, not just my own way of seeing. So I think just all of us being more intentional about who is telling our collective story, who's creating our collective visual history. That's the thing that I want people to engage with and think about most.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for the work you do and for taking the time today. And thank everyone for watching. We'll be back next week, and you can find more Danielle at all of the resources below. So until next time, thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me.